Transformative Principle, episode 72 with Ann Beninghof. Today I'm going to continue my conversation with Ann Beninghof, and we're going to talk about some really great stuff. We're going to talk about tapping into teachers' unique skill sets for co-teaching. We're going to talk about 1-minute formative assessments, and then the 9 models of co-teaching and how to help make that a really effective time. Thanks for listening. Please, if you wouldn't mind, take a moment and leave me a rating on this podcast in iTunes. That's how we help other people know that this podcast exists. And if it's helping you, I'd really love it if you took a minute to leave a rating there. The podcast today is brought to you by Simple School Sites. Go to jethrojones.com/simpleschoolsites to sign up for the mailing list so that you can be notified when Simple School Sites is live. It's going to take a new approach to providing websites to schools, and we'll make them beautiful, interactive, and have great social media integration. And I hope that you will take a minute and sign up for that. So we've talked a lot about the adult part of it, of setting things up and having the right people in the right partnerships and having common planning time. Let's talk a little bit now about how we set it up and meeting the needs of the students. So you've talked about the duet model, and so let's talk about how it looks in a classroom with the two teachers in there. What is the important thing that they need to be focusing on, and how do they set up that general classroom time together?
Every partnership is going to be a little bit different, and every day is going to be a little different depending upon what the needs of the students are and the learning targets for the day. So we have to keep in mind first that there's just that flexibility, whatever you envision, recognizing that it's going to morph a little bit from day to day into different variations. One of the structures that I like as a co-teacher, and I like to see with brand new co-teachers perhaps, I always like for the specialist to take responsibility for the first couple of minutes of a lesson. The hook, the bell ringer, the activator, whatever you want to call that opening piece. I think that's a great place for a specialist to take a lead for 2 reasons. First of all, it puts the specialist on the stage as a teacher from the first moment of class. It makes a clear statement to the students that the specialist is a teacher in the room. They are not there as just a helper or an aide. Mm-hmm. And it also makes that message clear to the general ed teacher if that hasn't been clear so far. But the second reason I think that's a great place for myself as a specialist to take the lead is that I have extra training in things like activating prior knowledge, grabbing attention, previewing vocabulary or text. All of those learning strategies are things that I have extra training in as a specialist. So it only makes sense that that would be a great place to tap into my skill set. And what we want the teams doing is constantly making sure that they are tapping into the unique skill set that's brought by both teachers to the class. So while I'm maybe leading those first couple of minutes, the gen ed teacher might be collecting homework, checking attendance, supporting what I'm doing by jumping in and asking questions or whatever that might be. And then after those first couple of minutes are done, we might flip to the general education teacher leading a mini lesson of some kind, bringing in their content expertise and perhaps doing a brief lecture or some kind of organized discussion with students. And while my colleague is doing that, I could be on the board capturing the points that he is making or students are making in some kind of a thinking map or graphic organizer. I might be showing good note-taking skills depending upon the age of the students, or jumping in and clarifying, adding examples, that type of interaction while the gen ed teacher is leading a lecture. Let's say that takes maybe 10 minutes. At that point, we're going to hopefully have some kind of formative assessment ready to go to have a sense of what kids need next. And then as soon as that quick 1-minute formative assessment is done, we're going to break students into groups. And that could be 2 groups, it could be 3 or 4. It's going to vary, and the composition of those groups is going to vary too. They might be homogeneous in terms of ability or skill-based for that particular lesson. They could be heterogeneous groups if we've decided we want mixed ability pairs or trios or fours so that they can support each other. We'll have decided that probably in advance, but we might decide that on the spot. And then one of us is going to monitor 1 or 2 groups while the other monitors and works with 1 or 2 groups. And we'll do group work for the significant portion of the rest of the lesson. We actually recommend that co-teachers in co-taught classrooms, that probably about 65% of the class time should be in other than whole group arrangements, so that we can really provide some more intense, direct instruction to the kids who need it the most. And then what I like is for the last couple of minutes of class to bring the whole class back together, and for the specialist to take the lead again in that last minute or two, because this is where we're doing our closure. We're summarizing, we're reviewing, we have an opportunity to hit one last time what that key learning target was for the day. And most specialists have extra training in memory strategies, review strategies, summarization strategies, all of those things. So it's a great place to tap into my expertise as a learning strategist. So that's how it might look. That's one example, but of course it's going to vary from that.
Mm-hmm. Well, what I like there is that you gave a really good outline of what an ideal lesson could look like. And wrapping your head around that makes it, for me at least, makes it feel much more doable when I look at it from that perspective. And that idea of 65% of the class time is spent in something other than whole group work. I like that idea. One of the problems I see with that is then, doesn't that just become a time for the special ed teacher to work with the special ed students and the general ed teacher to work with the general ed students? How do you prevent it from just being, okay, we're in the same room now, but we're still just teaching our own students?
There are times when it may be appropriate for the special ed teacher to be working just with some students with IEPs. We wouldn't want to see that every day, but there may be times those students have been identified as having some intense, unique needs, and it could be that based on the formative assessment, when we look at all the kids, that there are just a couple of kids with IEPs that need something extra and intense, and so we might pull them off to the side in the room while in one group while there are 3 or 4 other groups going on. And that might happen occasionally, and I don't want to say that there's no value in that. But often what we find through our formative assessment is that we have some students who have IEPs who got it. They understood the instruction and are ready to be in a different type of group. And we have some kids who aren't on IEPs that didn't get it. Sometimes we're surprised by what we might think of as our high flyers or kids who seem always ready for the next level, that for that particular skill or lesson, they didn't understand it. And so let's pull them into that group. So usually if we're breaking into groups and we do them ability-based, we're probably not going to just have a small group with just kids with IEPs. There's probably going to be some mixture in that no matter what. But again, we don't always do ability grouping. Sometimes it's ability grouping for that lesson, but much of the time it's going to be mixed ability groups so that kids can support each other. When we do a parallel model, we might have 2 heterogeneous groups. I might take half the class, she takes half the class, and now we have a smaller, better ratio of students to teacher so that we can get more rapid participation. So we might be teaching the exact same lesson, but in 2 separate groups. So instead of, let's say you have 30 kids in the class, instead of 30 students waiting to have a turn to make a comment or ask a question, you have one teacher with 15, one teacher with 15. They turn their desks quickly to face opposite sides of the room or something and kind of group around. And now we may have two exact same lessons going on, but with smaller instruction. The benefit for doing that still in the classroom, though, instead of pulling kids out, is that I can hear what my colleague is saying. I can kind of tune in to what she's saying. And if I'm not quite clear about something, I can quickly access her. You know, Mrs. Jones, let me ask you a quick question. Or I can jump up from my seat and go whisper to her, or clarify something, especially if I'm not as comfortable with the content, because maybe I'm not a content expert in that. And she can hear what I'm doing. So she can see a strategy perhaps I'm using with students and learn from me while I'm demonstrating that strategy with students, so that the professional learning that's going on is a constant and the communication can be a constant. So there is that benefit of even within the small group work, the two teachers are still learning from each other.
Yeah, well, I think that is great. Did I hear you correctly that you said that it was the parallel model?
That's one of the models.
Okay, mm-hmm. And then you also have the duet model. Is that the first example you gave?
Yes. Actually, I talk about 9 different models of co-teaching.
Okay.
Some people out there talk about 5 models of co-teaching. Some people talk about level 1 and level 2 co-teaching. It's not so important what you call it, I don't think. It's what it looks like in class. So the names are not so critical. There are probably dozens of ways that two teachers could co-teach together. But I think of 2 primary models would be the duet model, which is where the two teachers really share everything, all the big upfront planning that happens before school ever even starts, figuring out what the curriculum's going to look like and the major projects and themes and units, etc. And then all of the week-to-week planning is shared, all of the instruction and assessment and reteaching is shared. So the duet model is really has wonderful parity. Both teachers are fully utilized at every step in the instructional cycle. That requires a lot of planning time. So if we can't do that model because perhaps the specialist is assigned to teach with 3 or 4 different co-teachers, mm-hmm. and then that model becomes not realistic, then I suggest teachers or districts look at what I call the lead and support model, where the difference there is primarily in the stuff that happens before school starts or outside of the school day. The difference is that the gen ed teacher tends to do the big upfront planning and then would supply me with their outline of kind of where we're heading. These were the thoughts that I have about what to do here and there, and this is kind of how maybe I have taught this unit in the past. And then as a specialist, I'm still planning with them, but it's more of that week to week, let's tweak this, let me try this differently here, how about if we break into groups for this or that. And so the planning is more in response to an outline or a big plan that's already in place. But then the teaching is still shared in the class, as is the assessment. So in class, it may look very similar. It's what happens outside of class that's different. Then my other 7 models, they all are kind of ingredients in one of those 2 other approaches. And so how you group kids, whether it's a parallel grouping or a station grouping or a skills group, all of those grouping models, they're kind of ingredients. I also talk about a learning style model or a complementary skills model, adapting, etc. Those would all be ingredients that go into one of those 2 major approaches. Does that make sense? I know that's a lot of information.
Yeah, it does. And what I really wanted to get at, which I think you did well, is letting people know that there's not just, one right way to do it, that there's a multitude of ways to implement this, and that's what I think is valuable. And so, what the examples you gave, I think, give a good idea of how how the different emphasis could be, and then adding some other things in would enhance or change the co-teaching model a little bit based on what the needs of the students are in the classroom. And what I would hate for people to walk away from is that there's only this one way to do it, and this is only the only right way. And really, it is going to be unique for just about every classroom to a certain extent, and the big ideas are what carry over from classroom to classroom. Is that a fair summary?
Yes, very, very well put.
Thank you. So the next part is, what are some of the challenges that you face with students having two teachers, and some of the common pitfalls that teachers could run into in interacting with students?
Just like in a family where you have a child and two parents, sometimes students can try to play one teacher against the other. So we have to make sure that we have a common approach to behavior management in the classroom, common agreements about grading, about even things like whether students can get a pass to go to the bathroom, or all of those things need to be talked about so that the students don't try to work one teacher and then go to work the other teacher. You know, one teacher says no, the other teacher says yes. That can set up some problems. So as long as they're communicating well, the two teachers, and have talked through some of those essential items, I have a list, as an example, in my Co-Teaching That Works book of 16 questions that teachers should talk about before they start co-teaching. If they've had those discussions, then they're probably set for not really having any problems with students. We do strongly recommend that teachers use student surveys at the end of the year or even halfway through the year to find out how students are feeling about co-teaching so that we can get their input. Generally, the student surveys are very positive, but sometimes students will say something that's unexpected. I have seen in a student survey from a district that I was not working with, they contacted me because they were concerned about some things that popped up in their student surveys. One of the things that popped up was students saying, I felt like I was in the dummies class. Mm-hmm. And if we see that in a survey, it means that we're not making sure we're having enough rigor in the class. We're not doing a good enough job about perhaps doing formative assessment and regrouping and doing some enrichment groups as a result of that in class. So students can often tell us things that we may not have been aware of. But generally speaking, if co-teaching is done well, students are very responsive.
Yeah, and that brings up another question that I asked you on Twitter, didn't ask here yet. And what is the ideal ratio of students with IEPs to students without IEPs?
Generally speaking, we recommend no more than 30% of the class be on IEPs. Of course, the smaller you can make that proportion, the better. But in terms of scheduling co-taught classrooms and staffing them, if you spread students too thin, then teachers, the specialists, have to be spread very thinly across multiple classrooms. And maybe I'm then assigned to 6 or 8 classrooms, and there's no way I can plan with that many co-teachers. So to make it possible to co-teach, districts often have to cluster students with IEPs into a classroom. 30% is considered kind of a maximum for best practice, but an important feature is that the remaining 70% should be a mixture of students who are on grade level and above grade level. Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, what sometimes happens is administrators see that there are going to be 2 teachers in this class, and they say, oh, well, there's 2 teachers in that class. Let's put this kid in there because he's failing miserably, and let's put this kid in there because his behavior is out of control. And before you know it, that class becomes kind of a dumping ground for all the kids who might be struggling. So now we don't have good role models or a good range of discussion and depth of thinking, and we lose the benefits of an inclusive class. when we have too flat a range of kids in that class.
Yeah, that's really important. Um, so the other thing I want to know about that is, um, what do you do to prevent that feeling of this is the dummies class? You mentioned having high levels of rigor. Is that what you really focus on, or are there some other things that you do to make sure that students don't feel like they're in the dumb kid class?
I think probably there are three approaches that we use. First is to be communicating with parents right up front before the school year even starts that students will be in a co-taught class and that there are benefits for all kids in a co-taught class. So we need to be ready to sell that concept. Teachers need to, if they're approached over the summer in the grocery store by a parent who says, oh, my kid is going to be in a co-taught class, what do you think? We want teachers believing and ready to share that co-teaching is wonderful for all kids in the class, not just kids who may be struggling.
Mm-hmm.
So sending out that message so that everybody is excited that this is happening and that their kid is going to be in a co-taught class. So that would be one thing. The second thing is in the planning of the lessons, I have a form that I use for lesson planning. Everybody, of course, has different forms that they use, but on my form there's a section that says, how will we challenge? And I can't leave that blank. It's way too uncomfortable to have a big blank space on my lesson plan. Mm-hmm. It kind of shouts out at me saying, wait a minute, you didn't build in something to challenge. So when we're planning the lessons and figuring out what can we do to make sure we're adding some challenge for kids who are ready for that next step or for something more, once we've got that planned, we're much more committed to doing something in class. Mm-hmm. And then the third piece, I think, has to do with those groups. When we pull apart groups, sometimes it's appropriate to do enrichment groups. I'll give you an example from a middle school math class that I co-taught several years back. What we realized is that usually as we were finishing up the kind of mini lesson component before going into having kids work on some math problems to practice, we could usually tell which kids were getting it right away. You know, they were very obviously understanding and answering the questions, and so we knew they were getting it. So what would typically happen is that my math co-teacher would have a small station off to the side where he would pull those 3 or 4 kids who were getting it. He would pull them right away as we sent kids to work on their worksheets, and he would do an enrichment lesson with them for about 5 minutes to get them started on something different, something a little more intriguing with some higher rigor. And then he would send them off to work independently on those things. And by that point, I had been able to wander the room and assess which students weren't understanding the new skill. And then I would select those maybe 3 or 4 students and send them over to him at the station. They would transition over there, and then he could work with the students that weren't understanding. So that did a couple of things for us. One is that it did address those needs of the kids who are ready for more, and they felt as if their needs were being addressed. But the second thing that it did is because we were always pulling different groups, it took away some of the stigma of being pulled off to the side, the negative stigma for those kids who might otherwise struggle, because they weren't the only ones being pulled off to the side for a station. Now, we wouldn't do that every day, but again, that's one of the models that you might use as an ingredient to either the duet or the leader's support.
Yeah, I really like that. Thank you for going into that. What about students who are significantly below grade level? Is there a point where you say, you know, these kids are so far below grade level that they really only need the specialized instruction, or could we do students who are below grade level, 2 to 3 years, could they still handle being in a grade level class with the support of co-teaching?
Absolutely. Although, of course, we're always needing to make the decision on an individual basis, student by student. But students that are off grade level can still have their needs met in a co-taught class. if the teachers are flexible and working together and planning, doing lots of small group work, again, that's the importance of that 65% goal. I have a colleague who actually shoots for 75% small group work because that gives us more opportunity to provide some of that intensity. The specially designed instruction you mentioned, students shouldn't have to be pulled out to receive that. That's a really important point that I'm glad you raised. The specially designed instruction should be occurring in the co-taught classroom. It's the responsibility of the special educator to make sure that they are providing specially designed instruction on a daily basis in that general education classroom. They're not just there as a second set of hands. So they have to be continually creative about how can I provide this to a specific student or maybe to the whole class. How can we weave in that specially designed instruction in class? So I think it's very possible. There are times, though, when there are students that we've determined cannot have their needs met effectively, but we always want to start by trying to meet their needs in that least restrictive environment before deciding that they can't be. Right? It's always going from least to more restrictive is the important direction to take. So generally speaking, we can be successful with those students.
Great. So my last question is, I'm a principal. I want to start doing co-teaching. What should I start doing today, or what should be my first step in going down the path of co-teaching?
I think probably the first step is to get your teachers to have some kind of a common knowledge base. And as I mentioned, you could do that through a book study with a book like my Co-Teaching That Works or another book, or to do some video viewing and just start some discussion about, is this what we want, and then how are we going to get there? Then I would say we want to try to establish some connections between co-teaching and other initiatives that might be in the district. So how does this relate to multi-tiered systems of support? Mm-hmm. How does this relate to our literacy initiative or whatever it might be, so that teachers begin to understand those connections and don't see it as kind of an add-on? You probably also want to identify any policies or procedures, job descriptions, or evaluation systems that might be affected by co-teaching. Walk-through tools is another example that might be affected by co-teaching. How are we going to adjust our walk-through observation tool as appropriate? How are we going to adjust our evaluation system for people that are co-teaching? Do we need to alter any of those kinds of things? So that's kind of setting it up. And then maybe one other piece we haven't talked about at all is to determine some tools for evaluating your co-teaching efforts. Deciding those before you start to co-teach. Are we going to use test data to look at that? Engagement rates? Are we going to do some class-to-class comparisons? One of the schools that I was familiar with in Georgia used absenteeism rates to assess the value of their co-teaching, which I thought was a really interesting data point. So trying to have that in place before you start co-teaching rather than after a year or two has passed and then saying, hey, I guess we should probably evaluate what we're doing. Yeah. And then the next step, of course, is to provide some staff development for teachers so that they have some clear information that's provided to them along with some time to complete some of these discussions, go through and identify roles and responsibilities, identify models of grouping that they might want to do with their class and so forth. And I usually find that if districts can provide maybe a 2-day training over the summer and maybe 1 day for the teams to plan and prep and get some stuff under their belt together, if they can do that over the summer before school starts, that can be really helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Anne, thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it. I have learned a ton, and I know my listeners will benefit from it greatly as well. So thank you very much.
You're welcome. My pleasure.
Thank you so much for downloading and listening to this podcast. Please subscribe in iTunes or Stitcher. And please feel free to give us a rating on Stitcher Radio or on iTunes so that we can help spread the word about how much we're learning in this podcast. Thank you so much for listening. You can find me on Twitter at Jethro Jones.